Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, we are taking a look at the best decks in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier 0. We're taking a look at how dominant they were, and just overall, the best decks according to each other. That's basically it. So we're going to go over all of the more or less Tier 0 decks, the decks that were Tier 0 in some capacity, or at least similar in nature. And we're going to take a look at how strong they were and whether or not they could be considered Tier 0. Now, obviously, this is for the time and not necessarily currently. Because if it was currently, like, you know, you go back in time and you'd be like, well, yeah, Yata-Garasu is not a, you know, it's not a good deck. Wouldn't even be a Tier 1 deck, right? But obviously, Yata-Garasu back in the day was a Tier 0, because it was insane. Yada yada. You get my point, right? So we have a few tiers here. The bar, strong, weak, honorable mention, and then a Tier 1 deck, actually. I'm actually going to change this to Tier 1, actually. But you get my point. We're going to go quickly through this. Oops. Starting off with Kashtira. Kashtira was never really Tier 0. I'm going to put it in honorable mention. It was only ever Tier 0 in the TCG, and it was only ever Tier 0 because they nuked Tearlament, and there wasn't really another deck that came out around that time that was comparable, right? Because this was like before Rescue Ace got its new support and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. Like Unchained hadn't received its support as well. So it was just like, there wasn't any real decks to even compete with it. It was just kind of like, yeah, it's Kashtira, and that was it. So I wouldn't really say that this was necessarily that it itself was that strong of a deck. While it is a very powerful deck, and all of those cards read like absolutely custom cards, I don't think that it itself was that powerful, especially compared to a lot of the other decks. It didn't dominate nearly as hard. It wasn't nearly as oppressive. It was just kind of like nothing else was really there to even compete post Tearlament ban. Necros was actually a very strong Tier 0 deck. It dominated pretty hard. A lot of decks, almost no deck could compete with it. Yeah, that was basically it. It was just that dominant of a deck. Incredibly powerful deck, and really did showcase like what a ritual deck could look like in the future, or in the modern metagame. And yeah, it required multiple limitations to make it actually not Tier 0. So there's that. Then we have Spiral. Spiral was a mistake. Spiral was a goof in both the OCG and the TCG. It just it was a mistake. This was a mistake of a deck. I don't know how else to iterate this, but this deck was absolutely dominant for quite some time, required multiple nerfs, came back as Tier 1 multiple times, and is just an insane deck. Yeah, that's basically it. It eventually got power crept, but yikes. Next up, we have the Dragon Rulers. Dragon Rulers were technically never Tier 0, similarly to Kashtira. They had similar like representation, but that was because of this, which was never actually a Tier 0 deck and probably never would have been. It might have. If they hadn't released the Dragon Rulers, this probably would have been a Tier 0 deck. But Dragon Rulers were still incredibly powerful, and in terms of the power level of the metagame, they did definitely dwarf it, which is why I'm going to put them into strong Tier 0, because again, without Judgment, or Spellbook, I should say, without Spellbook, Dragon Ruler would have been a dominant Tier 0 strategy, right? I don't think they would have been so dominant that no other deck could compete, similar to like Spiral and some of the other decks that we have on this list. But in terms of a dominant deck that really would require multiple hits, yeah, absolutely. Spellbook, on the other hand, probably could have been Tier 0 if it had a similar thing to like Cash Hero, where it's just like, oh, cool, Dragon Rulers didn't release, therefore, yeah, it's just kind of like this deck. You just kind of play this deck because it's the best deck and it's by far the best deck. Next up, we have Tearlament, the best deck ever created. I'm not really going to explain this one. Tearlament Ishizu is a deck that kind of broke convention. It played on both players' turns. It played in a very difficult to interact with capacity, and it was able to interact with you as easy as could be. It had incredibly powerful effects, and yeah, it was also incredibly consistent at the time, which is yeah, it was just insane. It never had the actual like representation of Tier 0 that like Spiral did, or even Necros at times, but it definitely was the best deck ever. Sky Striker, I don't think ever actually by itself was Tier 0. Yes, a lot of like the engines and stuff like that were Tier 0, but Sky Striker itself I don't think ever actually really made Tier 0. It was definitely very strong, and a lot of the different engines that utilized the Sky Striker stuff were very powerful, but that was more so because the engine was strong and not necessarily because Sky Striker itself as a deck was dominant. And that's why I'm also going to put the Candina in here, and I believe, yeah, Orchist also. These all kind of were the same idea, and at the same time, they weren't ever actually really Tier 0. They may have been for like one event here or there, but they never really, at least in my mind, were so dominant that they were the deck to play. It was more so that while that was probably the best deck, there were definitely options to beat it. You could definitely play around it, and while the Sky Striker engine did make those decks significantly stronger, it wasn't necessarily Sky Striker itself that was Tier 0 or anything like that. Unless we're counting the OCG, which I don't necessarily... If we are counting the OCG, I don't think Sky Striker at any point was Tier 0. It may have been, again, for like a week or something like that, you know, for like a few events. But again, that was, to me, that was always more so the engine. And I'm not really going to count the engine as like a Tier 0, if that makes sense. Next up, we have the third deck that's going into the top here. Pepe. Pepe broke pendulums. And Konami has never recovered from Pepe. Konami has decidedly said, let's never do Pepe again. And because of that, we've basically never gotten a good Pendulum card since then. So yeah, this deck was very, very good. It was one of the... I think it was one of the few instances where in the TCG, there was an emergency ban list. There was like a week of play that you could play this deck. And it was a terrible week. Everyone was like, no, this sucks. It was not a very interesting format because it was either you play Pepe or you don't play the game. Yeah, that was it. There was like 2 events. That's it. Snake Eye is kind of Tier 0. In the TCG, it's definitely a lot stronger. And I got... Okay. If we're basing this off of the TCG, the problem that I have with Snake Eye, and the reason I don't want to put it in like strong Tier 0 or anything higher, is because it's currently happening. So I can't really say with like a definitive certainty that Snake Eye is so much more powerful. It is that much more dominant. I do think it's a Tier 0 deck, which is why I'm not putting it in like an honorable mention or Tier 1 or something like that. It's still Tier 0. It's still extremely dominant. It is still by far the best deck. It is still incredibly powerful, and there isn't really a deck that can compete with it. But a lot of people are playing a whole bunch of different decks because of just how expensive this deck is, so it really does skew the math and make it more difficult to really determine whether this deck is extremely powerful and by far the most dominant deck, or if it's just that people kind of jumped on the bandwagon, saw how good it was for a few events, and then saw, like, everyone else kind of saw the price point, and now they're just kind of looking for other answers and are finding them, or I don't, it's really hard to really say right now. So for right now, I'm going to put it in weak tier 0. I could see this being a strong tier 0, similar to Dragon Ruler, whereas like, yeah, currently at the time it was incredibly expensive, so it may not have had that representation that it should have, but I still feel like it's a very, very strong deck. There you go. Next up we have Zodiac. Zodiac is I'm gonna put into strong tier 0. This deck, similarly to Spiral, had insane amounts of longevity, where it was tier 1 multiple times. It came back with like Eldritch and stuff like that, and became tier 1 again, and with like Tri-Brigade. But overall, a very, very powerful deck. At its prime, had kind of just like changed the way that the game was played. Norden, I think, got banned basically because of this deck, and Broad Bull is still banned to this day because it's incredibly powerful. It's definitely been power crept, but it's still an insanely strong deck. But I don't feel like it was one of those decks that just entirely smothered everything else and nothing else was at all playable, because I do think that a lot of the other decks that came out at that time, like for example True Draco, were still able to compete. Yes, you could, it was basically all just like Zodiac and True Draco and stuff like that, but there were still other decks that could compete, and like the power level of the format was still pretty high just in general. So I feel like, well, it's not just, dwarfing everything else, it's still insanely powerful. Next up we have Yada. Yada, Chaos, early Chaos. You either played Chaos or you didn't play the game early on in Yu-Gi-Oh! The biggest problem that I have with Yada, or Yada Lock, is the fact that in early Yu-Gi-Oh! We don't really have much in terms of representation or like an understanding of that full metagame. Like, yes, we can go back and play like Goat and stuff like that, but at that point there were so many other cards. This is like very, very early Yu-Gi-Oh! Not even Goat, but like even before that, where this is a strong tier 0 and was the only thing to play, and it was not close, and it was not fun. Old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Was not fun back then. But yeah, it was incredibly consistent and just so much farther better than like everything else. Next up we have Dad. Yeah, Dad was Dad similar? See, this is where things get interesting, because Dad, it was definitely, no, yeah, it was just so incredibly powerful. It was another thing where it's like, yeah, you're playing that or you're not, and even though it was incredibly expensive, that was it. You were still just playing Dad. If you wanted to top, you were playing Dad. Everyone was just playing Dad. That was it. You were playing Dad. Now, the problem with both of these, well, more so the problem with this is that there were other builds that you could play of Dad. Like, you could play Teledad, or you could play like regular Dad, or you could play like Monarch Dad, or you could play this Dad or that Dad. And there were a bunch of different builds of Dark Arm Dragon stuff that were around at the time. But it was still very. You know what? I'm gonna bring both of these down. It's still incredibly powerful, and it's still an insane tier 0. Tier 0 just by itself is insane, but they're not quite of that same level. Gouki. Gouki's interesting. I'm putting it in honorable mention, but I'm wondering if I should. It might be stronger. But Gouki's weird. Because I've seen Gouki play. And a lot of the thing is, like, at the time, Gouki was strong, but so was everything else. And it wasn't like it was so dominant you couldn't play anything else. And there were a lot of decks that played other, like, it wasn't taking up representation to a tier 0 level like you would expect, and I really don't think it's that strong of a deck for the time. Like, it was definitely very powerful, and like Gumblar loops are absolutely insane. It was incredibly consistent and all of that stuff, but I still feel like it wasn't so far and away the best deck that like you couldn't play anything else. I'm gonna put it in weak tier 0. No. No, it's not that good. It was incredibly strong, and it was probably the best thing to play. And yeah, but I don't think it. I think the rest of the metagame was just more or less as strong. That's kind of it. Was this Pendulum FTK? I do not remember this ever becoming a tier 0 strategy. When was this? When was this Pendulum FTK thing? I don't ever remember this being a tier 0 deck. Like, I know most of the tier 0 decks. Especially the ones that are, like, actually definitively tier 0. You know, like these ones. I don't think this was ever actually tier 0. Or maybe it was emergency nerfed? I don't think so, right? I cannot remember this ever actually being tier 0. I remember it existing and I remember what it did, but I don't ever think it actually became tier 0. That may have just been due to representation, but because of that, I'm just going to put it in tier 1, actually. Sprite was tier 0 for like half of a second. And if we're talking TCG, it wasn't. I'm going to put it in honorable mention. Had Tearlament not come out in the same set as it, Sprite would be tier 0. But Tearlament did come out in the same set, so there you go. I'm actually just going to put it in tier 1, actually. Sprite was never really tier 0. It kind of was for like half of a second in the OCG, but I think that was more just because they didn't play Tearlament. They just didn't recognize how strong Tearlament was. I think that's genuinely what it was. Glad Beast. Tier 1 or honorable mention. I'm going to put it in honorable mention. I feel like this deck was... Okay, I'm lying to you. I'm putting it in tier 1. This deck was never tier 0. It was very strong. Don't get me wrong, but it was never tier 0. Adamantipator? Okay, so this is difficult. First of all, Adamantipator was not tier 0. Halka-Fibrax shenanigans, sure, but Halka-Fibrax was never... Adamantipator was never even close to tier 0. Because you could just do the same stuff with Eldritch. You just, like, normal summoned a Jet Synchron, made Halka-Fibrax, did the same line that, like, Adamantipator would do, and on the same, you know, monster board, and then you set 4. You set 4 Eldritch spells and traps, and just played Eldritch as well, which was more or less the same deck. And it competed similarly in, kind of, but there were a bunch of other decks that you could still play. Like, it wasn't just definitively, like, the best decks. Because you could also just do anything with Halka-Fibrax. Block Dragon was not that strong. Unless this is referring to something else, in which case I do not know it, and you're lying to me. This was never tier 0. This was never tier 0. I mean, kind of, maybe, but not really. I'm going to put this one in honorable mention. Black Wings were kind of tier 0. No, they weren't. I'm lying to you. No, they weren't. They were never tier 0. Same with Dino Rabbit. Same with this. This one was. This one was. Frog FTK was a strong tier 0. Frog FTK was just so much better than everything else. It was not close. That was a disgusting time. That was gross. Yeah, this deck was never tier 0. A lot of these decks were never, like, even remotely tier 0. Maybe. Okay, I'm gonna put Sprite in honorable mention because they were at least. I'm gonna put these two up here because they were actually technically tier 0 for at least a little bit. But, like, yeah, a lot of these were just not even close to tier 0. Maybe a little, but not really. They were definitely... Don't get me wrong. A lot of these decks, Dino Rabbit was incredibly dominant and was a very strong deck, by far the best deck in that current format at the time that you actually played that format. But looking back, it's not really all that dominant, and while it never had tier 0 representation, it probably never would have, because if anyone actually thought about that format and cared about it even remotely, you would notice that it's not just dominated by that one deck, right? Similarly to Wind Up format, similarly to Black Wings or any of these other things. A lot of it is just like, yeah, no, if you just like thought about it for more than like 5 seconds, there were other decks around that more or less could compete. And it wasn't like something that people weren't testing. It was just like, yeah, there just wasn't enough time until the new set came out or something like that changed the metagame. However, with that being said, Tearlament, Pepe, Spiral. I'm actually going to even move Zodiac up here. These decks are like what you think of when you think of Tier 0, right? When you think of what are the best decks that have ever graced the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! You think of Pepe, you think of Spiral, you think of Tearlament, you think of Zodiac, and then you go, let's never do that again. But when you think of like really bad Tier 0 formats, you think of things like Gouki, you think of things like Kashtira, you may even think of things like current Snake Eye because of just how expensive it is, right? So, there you go. All in all, though, all of these decks, to be fair, to every single one of these decks on this list, they were all by far the best deck in the room. Or, at the very least, in the metagame at the time, right? So, yes, Sky Striker I don't think was actually ever Tier 0. And sure, like, the engine technically could have been, but, like, at that point, Adventure Engine probably was, or, like, Halka Fibrax could have been Tier 0. You could argue that, right? Which, we're not gonna. But, does that mean it wasn't the best deck? Oh, no. It was the best deck. It was so incredibly powerful. Right? Same thing with Adamancipator. That deck was absolutely insane. Yeah. Was it Tier 1 actually? Yes. Because there were other decks that could compete, right? The rest of that metagame could compete. If that had been like, you know, had it been released slightly before, or had other cards not been released with it, yeah, a lot of these decks could have been Tier 0. But Konami knows what they're doing sometimes, and actually does, you know, give us other decks to at least compete. But yeah, that's it. That's going to be it for this episode. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy it. If you did, I like us very much. I'll appreciate it. Let me know your thoughts down below on whether or not you agree with this list. That's going to be it. Thank you guys so much for watching. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.